Hello, friend. Welcome to Science for Sleep. Tonight, we begin with something very old and very familiar. Something that grows quietly. Herbs have been part of human life for so long that it can be difficult to imagine a time without them. Before cities, before written language, before measured time, people noticed plants that returned each season and responded to care. These small, fragrant leaves became companions rather than inventions. Humans have used herbs for at least 10,000 years. This stretches back to a time when survival depended on close attention to the land. People learned which plants could be touched, which could be eaten, and which should be avoided. This learning did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly through repetition, memory, and shared experience. Herbs were among the first plants humans chose to grow intentionally, not in large fields, but close to where daily life happened, near shelters, along paths, just outside entrances. These plants did not require large tools or permanent structures. They asked only for light, water, and familiarity. Early humans learned about herbs through observation and trial. They noticed that certain leaves eased discomfort. Others improved the taste of stored food. Some plants returned stronger after being cut, while others disappeared. Over time, patterns emerged, and those patterns were remembered. This knowledge did not belong to one place or one culture. Nearly every ancient civilization developed herbal traditions on its own. Peoples separated by oceans and centuries still arrived at similar uses for plants. This was not coincidence. It was careful attention repeated across generations. At first, herbs were not valued for flavor alone. Many were used to preserve food before cold storage existed. Dry leaves slowed spoilage. Strong scents helped mask unpleasant odors. Herbs extended the usefulness of meals and made stored food safer to eat. The earliest written medical texts include references to herbs. But long before writing, herbal knowledge was carried in memory. Stories, routines, and daily habits preserved what worked. Parents showed children which leaves to gather. Elders remembered which plants returned each year. Drying herbs became one of the first preservation methods. Bundles of leaves were hung in open air. Sunlight and time removed moisture while concentrating aroma. This made herbs lighter, stronger, and easier to store. It also made them easier to carry from place to place. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you're welcome to subscribe. And if it feels natural, to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. It helps others find their way to this calm corner of the world, one sleepy traveler at a time. The quiet continues here, just as it is. Early herb use required no separation between food and care. The same plant could season a meal and soothe the body. This blurred boundary remained for thousands of years. Eating and healing were not separate acts. They were part of the same daily rhythm. Herbs were gathered slowly. Hands learned familiar shapes. Noses learned which scent signaled usefulness. Eyes learned where certain plants liked to grow. This attention anchored people to their surroundings. As humans moved across landscapes, herbs moved with them. Some were carried deliberately. Others followed unknowingly, spreading along paths and settlements. Over time, herbs adapted to new environments, and humans adapted their routines to the plants that thrived there. These early relationships were quiet. No announcements, no instructions, just repeated interaction between people and plants. Herbs became reliable because they were present, and they remained present because people cared for them. This long companionship still echoes today, in kitchens, in gardens, in familiar scents that signal comfort. The relationship began without urgency and without expectation, and it continues in much the same way. I'm glad you're here. Over long stretches of time, learning about herbs became less about discovery and more about refinement. Once early humans recognized that certain plants were useful, the quiet work shifted toward remembering, repeating, and adjusting. Nothing about this process was hurried. It unfolded at the pace of seasons and lifetimes. Some of the earliest written records humans left behind include references to herbs. Long before complex medical systems existed, people pressed symbols into clay or brushed ink onto papyrus to record plant names and uses. These records were simple. They did not explain why something worked, only that it did. A leaf for discomfort, a root for digestion, a flower steeped in warm water at night. Writing did not replace observation. It supported it. People still watched what happened when herbs were used. They noticed how long effects lasted, how the body responded, and whether the plant needed to be prepared differently next time. Knowledge stayed flexible, shaped by real experience rather than fixed instruction. Trial and error played a central role in how herbal understanding developed. Not every attempt was successful. Some plants did nothing at all. Others worked only in certain amounts or certain seasons. Over time, people learned to make small adjustments rather than large changes. This process favored patience. Herbs encourage slow learning because their effects were rarely immediate or dramatic. They work gently, sometimes subtly, requiring attention rather than urgency. This suited the human mind well, inviting calm observation rather than reaction. Preservation soon became just as important as discovery. Once people knew which herbs were useful, they needed ways to keep them available beyond their growing season. Fresh leaves wilted quickly, roots spoiled if left exposed. Drying emerged as a reliable solution. Drying herbs was simple but effective. Plants were gathered at certain times of day, often when their scent was strongest. Leaves were tied into small bundles and hung in open air. Sunlight and moving air slowly removed moisture. As water evaporated, aromatic compounds became more concentrated. This change was noticeable. Dried herbs smelled stronger than fresh ones. They took up less space. They lasted longer. People learned to recognize when drying was complete by touch and smell rather than measurement. Drying also made herbs portable. Lightweight bundles could be carried along trade routes or during seasonal migration. This allowed useful plants to travel far from their original environment. Some herbs adapted easily to new regions. Others remained tied to the places they first grew. Over time, people learned that drying altered flavor and strength. Some herbs became sharper, others mellowed. This understanding shaped how dried herbs were used, often in smaller amounts than fresh leaves. Again, adjustment came through repetition. Preservation techniques expanded slowly. Herbs were stored in clay vessels, woven baskets, or wrapped in cloth. Placement mattered. Darkness protected aroma. Dry air prevented mold. These practices were learned through failure as much as success. The act of preserving herbs created new routines. Certain days became associated with harvesting. Certain places were reserved for hanging bundles. These small rituals anchored time and gave structure to the year. They also created moments of quiet attention. Herbal knowledge continued to pass from one person to another without formal instruction. Children watched adults prepare plants. Hands learned by copying motion rather than following steps. Smell and texture guided decisions more than words. This sensory learning made the knowledge durable. As written language became more common, herbal records became more detailed. Lists of plants appeared alongside notes about preparation and timing. Still, these texts remained grounded in observation. They reflected what had been seen repeatedly, not theories or speculation. Even then, written records were never considered complete. They were references, not rules. People trusted lived experience as much as written words. If a plant behaved differently one year, the practice changed. Flexibility remained essential. The learning process surrounding herbs reinforced a particular relationship with time. Nothing needed to be rushed. Results arrived gradually. Understanding deepened through calm repetition rather than sudden insight. This rhythm shaped how people approached not only plants, but daily life itself. As herbs became more familiar, they faded into the background of routine. They were no longer objects of curiosity. They were simply there, hanging quietly, waiting to be used. This quiet presence allowed attention to soften. Herbs did not demand focus. They offered support without interruption. Their usefulness became steady rather than surprising. Through observation, trial, preservation, and time, herbs earned trust. Not through promises, but through consistency. They worked often enough to be remembered. They returned often enough to be relied upon. And they fit naturally into the slow patterns of human life. As herbs became familiar companions in daily life, attention shifted toward how they were kept, shared, and remembered. This stage of herbal history was quieter than discovery, but just as important. Once people trusted certain plants, they needed ways to carry that trust forward through time. Much of early herbal knowledge was passed down orally. Long before writing became common, people relied on memory, repetition, and shared routines. Stories were told while working. Instructions were woven into conversation. Learning happened alongside daily tasks rather than apart from them. This oral tradition shaped how herbs were understood. Information stayed simple and practical. Only what proved useful was remembered. Anything unnecessary faded naturally. In this way, herbal knowledge remained lean and adaptable. As communities grew, certain places became centers for preserving this knowledge. During the Middle Ages, monasteries played a key role in maintaining herbal traditions. Monks tended gardens, copied texts, and recorded plant uses. These gardens were not ornamental. They were functional spaces designed for reliability. Monastic herb gardens were often carefully organized. Plants were grouped by purpose rather than appearance. Some were grown for food, others for care of the body, still others for cleaning, scenting, or preserving materials. These gardens reflected a worldview where herbs were part of everyday maintenance. They were not exotic or rare. They were expected to be present and dependable. Care for plants mirrored care for daily life. Preservation remained central to this process. Drying herbs continued to be one of the most common methods. It required little effort once routines were established. Bundles were hung in familiar places. Time and air did most of the work. Drying changed how herbs were experienced. Fresh plants felt lively and green. Dried herbs felt quieter and more concentrated. Their scent lingered longer. Their presence became more subtle. This concentration made dried herbs practical. Smaller amounts were needed. Storage became easier. Herbs could be kept for months rather than days. This stability allowed people to rely on them year-round. Herbs were often stored in simple containers. Clay jars, wooden boxes, or cloth sacks were common. Location mattered more than the container itself. Dark, dry spaces helped preserve aroma. Cool air slowed deterioration. Over time, people learned to recognize freshness through the senses. Color fading signaled age. A dull scent suggested loss of strength. Touch revealed moisture or dryness. No tools were required beyond attention. Herbal knowledge also remained closely tied to place. People knew where certain plants grew naturally. They remembered which areas produced stronger leaves or healthier roots. Landscapes became mapped through experience rather than measurement. This familiarity created a sense of trust. Herbs did not surprise people. They behaved as expected when treated consistently. This reliability made them part of the background rather than the focus. They were noticed without being scrutinized. As herbal practices continued, they blended seamlessly into daily routines. Preparing herbs did not feel separate from preparing food or maintaining a home. The same hands that cooked also dried leaves and crushed stems. There was no sharp boundary between tasks. This integration shaped how people thought about care. Caring for the body, the home, and the land became linked. Herbs occupied the space between these concerns. They connected nourishment, maintenance, and comfort. Because herbs were woven into routine, they did not demand explanation. Their use was justified by repetition rather than reasoning. If something worked often enough, it stayed. If it did not, it quietly disappeared. This process favored calm continuity over innovation. New herbs were adopted slowly. Old ones remained in use for generations. Change happened gently, without disruption. Even as societies evolved, the core relationship with herbs remained steady. They were trusted because they had been present for so long. They asked little and offered consistency. This made them easy to live alongside. Through oral tradition, simple preservation, and routine use, herbs became embedded in human life. They did not need to be explained or defended. They simply continued. And in that continuation, they became part of the rhythm that carried people from one day to the next. As herbal knowledge settled into routine, people began to shape the spaces where these plants lived. Herbs were no longer only gathered when found. They were placed deliberately, arranged with intention, and kept close to daily life. This marked the quiet beginning of organized herb gardens. Early herb gardens were not designed for beauty. They were designed for access. Plants were grouped by use rather than appearance. Food herbs in one area, care-related herbs in another. Others set aside for scent, cleaning, or preservation. This organization reduced effort. When something was needed, it could be reached without searching. The garden itself became a kind of memory. Walking a familiar path reminded people where each plant belonged. Movement replaced written instruction. Smell played a central role in how herbs were evaluated and maintained. Before labels or records, scent was the quickest indicator of usefulness. Strong aroma suggested freshness. A fading scent signaled time or improper storage. The nose became an early tool for assessment. Many herbs produce aromatic compounds that release easily into the air. These scents were not created for humans. They evolved as defenses against animals and insects. Humans learned to notice them anyway, associating certain smells with reliability. Because scent traveled, herbs influenced their surroundings even when untouched. Gardens carried a quiet presence. Walking past them released subtle aroma into the air. This made herb gardens feel active even when no one was working in them. Beyond gardens, herbs were also used inside living spaces. Before modern sanitation, strong scents served practical purposes. Herbs were burned to freshen air. Leaves were crushed and scattered on floors. Bundles were placed near entrances to introduce familiar smells. Burning herbs released aromatic compounds into enclosed spaces. Smoke carried scent farther and longer than fresh leaves alone. This practice was common across cultures, often without ceremonial meaning. It was simply effective. Herbs also help mask unpleasant odors. In dense living environments, this mattered. Stored food, animals, and waste all contributed to background smells. Herbs softened these environments without requiring structural change. This use further blurred the boundary between function and comfort. Herbs improved living conditions without drawing attention to themselves. They worked quietly through presence rather than action. Organization extended beyond the garden itself. Herbs were often stored near kitchens or work areas. Accessibility mattered more than formality. What was used often stayed close. What was used less frequently was kept farther away. Over time, people learned which herbs benefited from frequent cutting and which did not. Some grew fuller when harvested regularly. Others weakened. Gardens were adjusted accordingly, reflecting experience rather than design. This constant, small adjustment shaped how people thought about care. Nothing was fixed permanently. Arrangement responded to use. Plants and people influenced one another through repetition. The act of tending herbs became less about effort and more about familiarity. Hands knew where to reach. Feet followed known paths. Attention softened because the work was predictable. These spaces encouraged a slower pace. Herb gardens did not demand speed. They responded best to regular, gentle attention. This aligned naturally with daily rhythms. As herb gardens became more common, they influenced architecture and layout. Living spaces often opened toward areas where herbs were kept. Paths passed through them. Doorways faced them. This kept herbs within sight and reach. The presence of herbs in daily environments reinforced their role as companions rather than resources. They were seen often but handled lightly. Their usefulness came from availability rather than intensity. Through simple organization, sensory awareness, and proximity, herbs became woven into physical space. They shaped how people moved, how they stored, and how they maintained their surroundings. Nothing about this required instruction. It emerged naturally from repeated use. Herb gardens did not announce themselves as innovations. They appeared quietly, shaped by necessity and habit. And once established, they remained, changing slowly over time, just as the plants themselves did. As herbs became established in living spaces and gardens, people began to notice additional patterns. Some plants seemed to influence their surroundings even when untouched. This influence was subtle, but consistent enough to be remembered. Certain herbs naturally repel insects. They do this through volatile oils released into the air. These compounds developed as protective mechanisms long before humans took notice. Insects learned to avoid these scents. Humans eventually noticed the same effect. This discovery did not arrive as a single insight. It emerged slowly. Areas where certain herbs grew had fewer insects. Stored items placed near dried leaves were less disturbed. Over time, people associated these plants with protection rather than decoration. Herbs used for this purpose were placed deliberately. Bundles were hung near doorways. Leaves were tucked into storage spaces. Plants were grown near sleeping areas or food stores. These placements required no special preparation, only familiarity. Protection extended beyond insects. Some herbs help slow spoilage when stored with food. Their natural compounds interfered with microbial growth. This effect was not understood in scientific terms. It was simply observed and repeated. Because of this, herbs became part of food preservation routines. They were added to stored grains, dried meats, and fermented foods. The goal was not flavor alone. It was stability. Herbs help food last longer without changing the process itself. Warm water extraction became another common use. Herbal teas were among the earliest prepared beverages. Leaves, roots, or flowers were placed in warm water and left to rest. Heat helped release aromatic and soluble compounds. Time did the rest. These preparations fit easily into daily life. Water was already being heated for meals. Adding herbs required no additional tools. The process was slow and predictable. Results were gentle rather than dramatic. Different herbs responded differently to warmth. Some released scent quickly. Others required longer steeping. People learned these differences through repetition rather than instruction. Preparation became intuitive. The distinction between fresh and dried herbs grew clearer through use. Fresh herbs often offered brighter, lighter scents. Dried herbs carried deeper, more concentrated aromas. Each had its place depending on season and availability. This variation encouraged flexibility. If fresh herbs were unavailable, dried ones worked. If one plant was scarce, another might serve a similar role. Herbal practice adapted easily to circumstance. Herbs also influenced how spaces felt. Their presence softened environments. Scents signaled familiarity and safety. They marked certain areas as lived in and cared for. This effect required no conscious attention. Over time, people learned to combine herbs for layered effects. Some combinations enhanced preservation. Others improved aroma. These pairings were refined slowly, shaped by experience rather than theory. Because herbs worked through presence rather than force, they did not demand constant attention. Once placed, they continued to release their properties quietly. This made them well suited to long periods of rest or storage. Herbs also encouraged observation of environment. People noticed changes in insect behavior, food condition, and air quality. These observations reinforced trust in the plants. They also deepened awareness of surroundings. The use of herbs for protection and preservation blurred lines between care and maintenance. Looking after food, space, and comfort became interconnected. Herbs sat at this intersection, supporting multiple needs at once. As these practices spread, they became habitual. No special thought was given to placing herbs in certain locations. It was simply how things were done. The practice continued because it worked often enough. This quiet effectiveness strengthened the relationship between people and plants. Herbs did not compete for attention. They contributed without interruption. Their usefulness was felt more than noticed. Through protection, preservation, and gentle preparation, herbs expanded their role in daily life. They supported stability without altering routines. And in doing so, they remained present in the background, quietly influencing the spaces people inhabited. Herbs did not belong to one place. They appeared wherever humans settled and wherever plants could adapt. Over time, people noticed that herbs grew on nearly every continent, spreading quietly across the world. Only the coldest regions remained untouched. Everywhere else, herbs found ways to persist. Some herbs learned to survive in extreme heat and drought. They developed deep roots, small leaves, or protective oils that slowed moisture loss. In dry landscapes, these plants thrived where others failed. Their presence signaled resilience rather than abundance. People learned to recognize which herbs belonged to these harsher environments. Other herbs preferred cool, shaded places. They grew beneath trees, along forest edges, or near streams. These plants responded to gentler light and consistent moisture. Their leaves were often softer. Their scents tended to be lighter and more delicate. This wide range of preferences allowed herbs to spread alongside human movement. As people traveled into new climates, different plants took on importance. Herbal traditions shifted naturally, shaped by what the land provided. No single system dominated. Adaptation happened quietly. Many herbs evolved strong scents as a defense mechanism. These aromas discouraged animals and insects from feeding on them. The compounds responsible for scent were not meant to attract humans. They existed long before people noticed them. Humans simply learned to pay attention. Over time, people began associating strong herbal aromas with usefulness. A plant that smelled distinctive was easier to remember. Its presence stood out among surrounding vegetation. Scent became a guide for selection. Reliability followed recognition. Some herbs gained a reputation for consistency. They worked often enough to be trusted. Because of this reliability, certain herbs were considered sacred in some cultures. Not because they were rare, but because they were dependable. They returned season after season without requiring much effort. Herbs were rarely separated from food in early use. They were prepared alongside meals rather than apart from them. Leaves were added during cooking. Roots were stored near other ingredients. The act of eating and the act of care overlapped. This blurred boundary shaped how people thought about nourishment. Food was not only sustenance, it was also maintenance. Herbs occupied the space between these roles without distinction. They belonged to both. As communities grew, herbs became part of early trade. They were exchanged along routes that carried goods between regions. Dried herbs traveled especially well. They were lighter, more compact, and longer lasting than fresh plants. This made them valuable beyond their place of origin. Trade introduced herbs to new environments. Some adapted easily, others required careful cultivation. Either way, movement expanded herbal diversity rather than replacing it. Local traditions absorbed new plants gradually. Storage methods reflected this movement. Herbs were often kept in bundles or clay containers. These containers protected them from moisture and light. Over time, storage needs influenced container design itself. Form followed function. Herbs also carried meaning beyond daily use. Some were included in burial rituals. They were placed with the dead as familiar companions. Scents associated with life continued into remembrance. This practice appeared in many cultures independently. The belief that herbs accompanied the dead reflected continuity rather than loss. Plants that supported daily life were trusted to remain present. Their role extended beyond practical use into symbolic presence. They marked transition without disruption. Herbal gardens were often located close to living spaces. Proximity mattered. Plants that were used regularly needed to be accessible. Gardens became extensions of the home rather than separate areas. This kept herbs within sight and reach. Certain herbs took on symbolic meaning over time. Some came to represent protection. Others signaled remembrance. These associations developed slowly, shaped by repeated use rather than instruction. Symbolism followed experience. Herbal smells became closely linked to memory. Scents carried strong associations with places and routines. This connection formed naturally through repetition. A familiar aroma signaled safety, care, or home. Memory followed scent without effort. Across climates and cultures, herbs adapted alongside people. They required little once established. They responded predictably to care, and they remained present through change. Through global spread, trade, and adaptation, herbs became a quiet constant. They connected distant places through shared routines, and they continued to link modern life to ancient patterns, unchanged in their simplicity. As herbs continued to travel with people, their role expanded beyond daily use into shared meaning. Plants that proved reliable over time began to carry significance that went beyond practicality. This significance did not appear suddenly. It formed slowly, shaped by repetition and trust. Some herbs were considered sacred because they worked consistently. They returned when expected. They grew with minimal care. They responded predictably to harvesting and storage. Reliability itself became meaningful. In many cultures, these dependable herbs were treated with respect rather than reverence. They were not placed on pedestals. They were kept close. Their value came from presence, not rarity. Sacredness emerged through familiarity. Herbal remedies were commonly used alongside food rather than apart from it. There was no separate category for healing. Plants that supported the body were often the same ones that flavored meals. Preparation happened in kitchens, not specialized spaces. Care blended seamlessly into routine. This overlap blurred the boundary between nourishment and maintenance. Eating was also a way of caring for the body. Herbs supported this relationship without requiring explanation. They did not announce their purpose. They simply participated. Because of this integration, herbal knowledge remained accessible. It did not belong exclusively to specialists. Families shared practices across generations. Use was learned through daily exposure rather than instruction. Everyone participated in some way. As communities connected with one another, herbs became part of trade networks. They traveled alongside grains, textiles, and tools. Unlike fragile goods, dried herbs tolerated long journeys. They arrived intact, carrying their scent and usefulness with them. This made them valuable across distances. Trade routes allowed herbs to move far from their original environments. Some plants became familiar in regions far from where they first grew. Others remained closely tied to their native climates. Either way, exchange increased diversity rather than replacing local practices. Dried herbs were especially well suited for travel. Their reduced weight made them easier to carry. Their concentrated aroma signaled quality even after time had passed. People learned to recognize freshness through scent alone. This sensory evaluation crossed language barriers. Storage practices reflected this mobility. Herbs were bundled tightly to protect leaves and stems. Clay containers offered stable environments that resisted moisture. These containers evolved in response to what they held. Design followed need. As herbs circulated, they gathered layers of meaning. Some became associated with protection, others with remembrance or continuity. These associations were not assigned deliberately. They developed through repeated use in specific contexts. In some cultures, herbs were included in burial rituals. They accompanied the dead as familiar elements from daily life. This gesture reflected trust rather than belief. Plants that supported the living were expected to remain present in transition. Nothing dramatic was implied. The presence of herbs in these rituals emphasized continuity. Life routines extended beyond individual lifespan. Herbs represented something steady and recurring. They returned season after season, regardless of human change. This reliability carried symbolic weight. Herbal gardens remained close to living spaces. This proximity reinforced their role as companions rather than resources. People passed them daily. They were seen often but handled lightly. Their presence felt stable. Over time, certain herbs became symbols through association. A plant placed near entrances suggested protection. One included in remembrance signaled continuity. These meanings were reinforced quietly, without instruction. Experience shaped understanding. Herbal smells strengthened these associations. Scent connects closely to memory. Repeated exposure linked specific aromas to places and moments. This connection formed automatically. Memory followed scent without effort. As these patterns continued, herbs became woven into cultural identity. They reflected local environments, shared routines, and collective memory. They did not require explanation to hold meaning. Their presence was enough. Through trade, symbolism, and shared practice, herbs moved beyond function. They became markers of continuity across time and place. They supported daily life while quietly carrying meaning forward. And they did so without demanding attention, just as they always had. As herbs continued to settle into daily life, attention turned toward how they were kept, remembered, and carried forward. Once a plant became familiar, the question was no longer whether it worked, but how to preserve its presence over time. Storage became a quiet extension of use. Many herbs were stored in simple bundles. Stems were gathered together and tied with string or twine. These bundles were hung from beams, hooks, or walls where air could circulate. The arrangement was practical rather than decorative. Visibility helped people remember what they had. Clay containers became another common method of storage. Clay offered stability. It protected herbs from moisture while allowing slow air exchange. These containers were often unglazed and plain. Their purpose mattered more than their appearance. Over time, herbal storage influenced the shape and size of containers themselves. Jars were made narrow to limit air exposure. Lids were fitted to keep out dampness. Design responded to experience. What preserved herbs best became standard. Storage spaces were chosen carefully. Darkness helped maintain aroma. Dry conditions reduced spoilage. Cool air slowed deterioration. These choices were learned gradually, through observation rather than instruction. Because herbs were used often, storage needed to be accessible. They were not hidden away. They were kept near kitchens, workspaces, or entrances. This placement made use effortless. What was easy to reach was easy to remember. Some herbs were kept specifically for occasions beyond daily use. Certain plants were set aside for rituals or moments of transition. In many cultures, herbs were included in burial practices. They were placed with the dead as familiar elements from everyday life. This gesture reflected continuity rather than loss. Herbs in burial rituals were not chosen for rarity. They were chosen for familiarity. Plants that had supported daily routines were trusted to remain present. Their scent and texture carried memory. They softened transition through recognition. The belief that herbs accompanied the dead into the afterlife appeared in many places independently. This belief did not require shared doctrine. It emerged naturally from long association. What had been reliable in life was expected to remain so beyond it. Beyond ritual, herbs continued to mark living spaces. Herbal gardens were often located close to homes. Paths passed through them. Doorways opened toward them. This kept herbs woven into daily movement. Certain herbs developed symbolic meaning through repeated placement. Plants near entrances came to represent protection. Those associated with remembrance took on quieter significance. Symbolism followed habit rather than instruction. Meaning emerged through repetition. Herbal smells played a powerful role in this process. Scent is closely linked to memory formation. A familiar aroma can recall a place or moment without effort. Herbs created these associations naturally through daily exposure. Memory followed presence. Because of this, herbs anchored people to their environments. A particular scent signaled home. Another signaled a season. These cues required no conscious thought. They worked quietly in the background. Over time, the presence of herbs shaped emotional landscapes as much as physical ones. They softened spaces. They created continuity across days and years. They reminded people of routines that repeated reliably. This steadiness mattered. As herbal storage and placement became routine, attention to them decreased. They no longer required active focus. Hands reached automatically. Eyes recognized containers without searching. Herbs became part of the environment rather than objects within it. This familiarity allowed mental space to open. Nothing needed to be decided. Nothing needed to be evaluated. Herbs were simply there, ready when needed. This predictability supported calm. Through storage, ritual, and proximity, herbs became more than tools. They became markers of continuity across time. They carried memory through scent and repetition. And they remained present in both daily life and moments of transition, quietly fulfilling their role. Their influence extended beyond physical spaces and into the inner landscape of memory and sensation. People began to notice that certain scents carried more than aroma. They carried feeling. Herbal smells are strongly linked to memory formation. This connection exists because scent is processed in parts of the brain closely tied to memory and emotion. Unlike other senses, smell does not take a long, indirect route. It arrives quickly, often before conscious thought. Long before this was understood biologically, people noticed the effect. A familiar herb could recall a place instantly, a kitchen, a garden, a specific time of year. Memory surfaced without effort. Because herbs were used repeatedly in daily routines, their scents became anchors. Grinding leaves, hanging bundles, steeping warm water. These actions repeated often enough to imprint themselves quietly. Over time, scent and memory became inseparable. This is one reason herbs felt comforting rather than stimulating. Their smells were predictable. They did not surprise the body. They signaled familiarity and safety. The nervous system responded by softening attention. Some herbs contain compounds that interact gently with the nervous system. These compounds evolved as plant defenses, not as human tools. Humans simply noticed the effects through experience. Certain plants felt calming. Others felt clarifying or grounding. These effects were never isolated from context. Herbs were experienced alongside warmth, rest, and routine. A preparation was rarely taken in isolation. It occurred during meals, evenings, or moments of pause. This pairing reinforced association. Because of this, herbs did not feel intrusive. They blended into existing rhythms rather than interrupting them. Their influence was subtle. It accumulated slowly through repetition. Nothing needed to be forced. As societies changed, herbal knowledge continued to inform modern science. Many contemporary medicines are derived from plant compounds first identified in herbs. These discoveries did not appear suddenly. They built upon generations of observation. Laboratory isolation followed lived experience. This connection highlights continuity rather than replacement. Modern medicine did not erase herbal knowledge. It refined certain aspects of it. The original relationship between humans and plants remained intact. It simply took on new forms. Even so, the everyday sensory relationship persisted. People continued to associate certain scents with calm, focus, or familiarity. These associations formed early and lasted long. They required no explanation. The body remembered. Herbal preparations were often adjusted by season. Not all plants were used the same way year-round. Availability changed. Needs shifted. Preparation followed the environment rather than a fixed schedule. This seasonal adjustment reinforced awareness of time. Certain scents belonged to certain parts of the year. They marked transitions quietly. Without calendars or clocks, the body recognized change through aroma. Memory aligned with season. Because herbs work gently, they encouraged a slower relationship with sensation. There was no rush to feel something. Attention could rest. The nervous system responded to familiarity rather than novelty. This steadiness supported rest. As herbal use continued across generations, these sensory patterns deepened. Children grew up surrounded by the same scents their parents knew. Memory extended beyond individual experience into shared atmosphere. Herbs became part of collective familiarity. This familiarity did not require belief or explanation. It existed through presence, through repetition, through time. The nervous system learned what to expect. In this way, herbs influenced not only the body, but perception itself. They shaped how spaces felt, how time passed, how memory surfaced, all without demanding attention. Through scent, sensation, and subtle interaction with the nervous system, herbs became quiet companions to the human mind. They did not speak loudly. They did not need to. Their presence alone was enough to leave an imprint that lasted. People began to align their attention not just with plants, but with time itself. Herbs were never separated from seasons. Their growth, strength, and availability changed throughout the year. Over time, people learned to listen to these rhythms rather than resist them. Herbal harvesting often followed seasonal cycles. Plants were gathered when they were ready, not when they were needed. Leaves were cut before flowering. Roots were taken when energy had returned underground. Timing mattered as much as technique. In many cultures, harvesting also followed lunar cycles. The moon became a quiet reference point. Certain phases were associated with stronger growth or better preservation. These patterns were not written as rules. They were remembered through repetition. Following these cycles encouraged patience. If a plant was not ready, it was left alone. Waiting became part of the process. This waiting reinforced trust in natural timing rather than urgency. Herbs taught people when to act and when to pause. Repeated harvesting revealed another pattern. Some herbs responded positively to being cut. When harvested gently and regularly, they grew more vigorously. New shoots appeared. Leaves became fuller. This relationship encouraged careful interaction rather than extraction. People learned to harvest in ways that supported regrowth. Only parts of the plant were taken. Roots were left undisturbed when possible. This ensured the plant's return. Sustainability emerged through observation rather than instruction. Herbs were commonly grown near kitchens for convenience. Proximity mattered. Plants used daily needed to be within reach. Stepping outside to gather a handful of leaves became part of meal preparation. This closeness reinforced routine. Kitchen gardens also reflected seasonal shifts. Some herbs thrived in warmer months. Others persisted into cooler weather. Their presence changed gradually rather than suddenly. The garden itself marked time. Many herbs attracted pollinators such as bees. Their flowers provided nectar and shelter. This relationship supported both plant and environment. People noticed that herb gardens often felt alive even when still. Movement continued quietly. As humans spread across different climates, herb diversity increased. New environments supported different plants. Herbal traditions adapted accordingly. What worked in one region shifted in another. There was no single correct approach. Some herbs naturally hybridized without human intervention. Cross-pollination occurred over time. New varieties appeared gradually. These changes were often noticed only after several seasons. Variation became part of familiarity. Herbal traditions adapted to local environments over centuries. Practices shifted slowly. Plants that thrived were kept. Those that struggled faded away. Adaptation happened without disruption. Many herbs required minimal care once established. They returned each year with little effort. This reliability reduced the need for constant attention. Gardens became spaces of presence rather than labor. Care became lighter over time. Because herbs fit easily into daily routines, they persisted across generations. Children learned where plants grew by walking familiar paths. Harvesting became a shared activity. Knowledge transferred quietly through repetition. No formal teaching was needed. As years passed, herbs remained present even as societies changed. Tools evolved. Living spaces shifted, but the relationship with plants endured. Herbs continued to mark seasons and routines. This continuity linked modern life to ancient patterns. Stepping into a kitchen garden mirrored actions taken thousands of years earlier. Cutting leaves followed the same rhythms. Waiting for regrowth felt familiar. Time folded gently. Through seasonal cycles, harvesting patterns, and quiet adaptation, herbs reinforced a slower sense of time. They asked people to move with nature rather than against it. They rewarded patience and attention, and they remained steady companions as days turned into years. With herbal traditions continuing across time, they became something steady rather than deliberate. What once required attention settled into habit. Herbs no longer felt like tools to be chosen. They felt like elements that simply belonged. Many herbs require very little care once established. After taking root, they return year after year with minimal effort. They respond to light, water, and time without demanding constant supervision. This reliability made them easy to live alongside. They fit naturally into daily life. Because of this, herbs remained present even as circumstances changed. Homes shifted, technologies evolved, but familiar plants continued to grow near kitchens, along paths, and in small garden spaces. Their presence felt ordinary rather than intentional. Herbs have remained part of human daily life across generations. This persistence did not depend on belief or tradition alone. It depended on usefulness that repeated itself. If a plant worked often enough, it stayed. If it did not, it faded quietly. Over time, herbs became markers of routine rather than objects of focus. They were reached for without thought, harvested without ceremony, prepared without explanation. Their role became automatic. This automatic presence created continuity. A child learning to gather herbs repeated motions practiced long before. Hands moved in familiar ways. Timing felt intuitive. Knowledge passed forward without being formally taught. Herbal traditions adapted without breaking. As climates shifted and communities moved, practices changed subtly. New plants replaced old ones when needed. Preparation adjusted to available resources. The core relationship remained intact. Some herbs naturally hybridized over time. Without human intervention, plants crossed and adapted. New varieties appeared gradually. These changes were absorbed into routine rather than highlighted. Variation became part of familiarity. As human populations spread across different environments, herb diversity increased. Each region developed its own patterns. Local plants shaped local routines. There was no universal system to preserve. Adaptation became the tradition itself. Despite these changes, herbs remained uncomplicated. They asked little. They responded predictably. They continued to grow with minimal care. This simplicity supported their endurance. Herbs did not require constant attention to maintain their role. They thrived in the background of daily activity. This allowed people to focus elsewhere. Care happened naturally through presence rather than effort. Nothing needed to be optimized. Over generations, this relationship created a sense of familiarity that extended beyond individual memory. Even without knowing why, people recognized certain plants as belonging. Their scent, appearance, and placement felt correct. This recognition required no explanation. The use of herbs connects modern humans to ancient routines. Preparing food with familiar leaves mirrors actions taken thousands of years ago. Harvesting follows the same gentle patterns. Waiting for regrowth feels unchanged. Time compresses quietly. This connection does not rely on nostalgia. It exists through repetition, through the simple act of tending what grows nearby. Herbs bridge past and present without effort. They continue because they always have. As daily life moves forward, herbs remain where they have always been. Near kitchens, in small gardens, within reach. Their presence is steady rather than symbolic. They do not demand attention or explanation. They simply continue to grow, return, and be used. This quiet continuity is what has allowed them to persist for so long. And it is what keeps them woven into human life, generation after generation. Soon, the relationship shifted gently, from gathering to cultivation. At first, most herbs were collected from the wild. People learned where certain plants grew naturally and returned to those places season after season. Paths formed through repetition rather than planning. Land was remembered through use. Wild herbs often had stronger flavors than the plants grown later in gardens. They grew without human selection, shaped only by environment. Leaves were smaller. Aromas were more intense. Their strength reflected the conditions they survived. As gathering continued, people began to favor certain plants over others. Those with desirable qualities were returned to more often. Seeds were dropped unintentionally near living spaces. Cuttings were taken from reliable plants. Slowly, proximity replaced chance. Selective harvesting began to change herbs over time. Plants that tolerated cutting survived and returned. Those that did not slowly disappeared from daily use. Leaves became larger. Aroma shifted subtly across generations. This change was never planned. It emerged naturally from repetition. People took what worked and left the rest. Over time, herbs adapted to human presence just as humans adapted to the plants. Cultivation grew out of familiarity rather than design. Some herbs naturally grow back after cutting. When harvested gently, they respond by producing new growth. This made them sustainable food sources long before sustainability was named. Careful interaction rewarded patience. Aggressive removal did not. Because of this regrowth, people learned restraint. Only part of the plant was taken. Roots were left intact. This ensured return rather than loss. The relationship became reciprocal. As cultivation expanded, early herb gardens began to appear. These gardens were modest and practical. They included plants gathered from nearby landscapes. They also included herbs brought from other regions. Native and imported plants grew side by side. Imported herbs did not replace local ones. They were added gradually. If a plant adapted well, it stayed. If it struggled, it faded quietly. Gardens reflected environment rather than intention. The presence of imported herbs expanded variety without disrupting routine. People adjusted slowly. Preparation methods shifted gently. New scents entered familiar spaces. Diversity increased through exposure rather than replacement. Cultivation also reduced uncertainty. Instead of traveling long distances to gather herbs, people could choose to rely on plants growing close to home. This proximity made use more frequent. Herbs became part of everyday activity rather than occasional effort. Reliability increased. As herbs moved closer to living spaces, attention softened. Plants were observed casually rather than searched for. Growth was noticed over time. Harvesting became easier and more regular. Gardens supported routine. Despite cultivation, wild gathering did not disappear. People continued to collect herbs from natural environments. Wild plants retained their place alongside cultivated ones. Both approaches existed together. There was no sharp division. This coexistence preserved flexibility. If a garden failed, the wild remained. If a season changed, gathering adjusted. Herbal practice stayed responsive rather than fixed. Adaptation remained central. Through gradual cultivation, herbs changed in form, but not in role. They remained familiar, accessible, and dependable. Their presence near homes reflected trust built over generations. Nothing about this transition required instruction. It unfolded naturally. From wild landscapes to simple gardens, herbs followed human life closely. They adapted to care without losing resilience. And in doing so, they became steady companions, growing quietly alongside the routines that sustained them. When herbs moved from wild spaces into gardens, people began to notice how these plants sustained themselves over time. Understanding did not come through study, but through watching what returned and what did not. Reproduction revealed itself slowly, through seasons of growth and absence. Some herbs spread easily by runners rather than seeds. Thin stems extended outward from the parent plant. Where they touched soil, new roots formed. This allowed a single plant to become many without intervention. Expansion happened quietly. These spreading herbs filled space gradually. They softened the edges of paths and beds. Their movement was subtle enough to be overlooked. Only over time did their presence become clear. Growth revealed itself through persistence. Other herbs reproduced primarily through seeds. Seeds were carried by wind, water, or animals. This allowed plants to appear in unexpected places. Distance did not prevent continuity. Movement became part of survival. Herb seeds can remain viable in soil for several years. They wait beneath the surface, responding only when conditions are right. This dormancy allows plants to endure unfavorable seasons. Absence does not mean loss. Time becomes a protective factor. Some herbs germinate only under specific temperature conditions. Warmth signals safety. Cool periods delay growth. These responses align plants with seasonal rhythms. Timing matters more than speed. Because of this, gardens sometimes appeared quiet even when seeds were present. Nothing seemed to happen for long stretches. Then, with the right change in temperature, growth began. This unpredictability taught patience. Waiting became part of the process. The scent of herbs is produced by volatile organic compounds released into the air. These compounds are stored within leaves, stems, and flowers. They evaporate easily, carrying aroma beyond the plant itself. Scent becomes presence. The plant reaches outward without moving. These aromatic compounds serve protective purposes. They help deter grazing animals and insects. Strong scent signals defense rather than invitation. Plants that survive develop stronger chemical signals. Evolution favored resilience. Humans learned to recognize herbs by smell before appearance. Scent traveled farther than sight. A familiar aroma could identify a plant hidden among others. This sensory recognition guided gathering and harvesting. The nose led before the eyes. Over time, people learned that flowering signaled a change. Many herbs produce flowers that indicate peak harvest time. Leaves collected before flowering often tasted different than those gathered after. This shift became noticeable through experience rather than instruction. Observation shaped timing. Flowering also marked transition. Energy moved from leaves to flowers and seeds. This changed aroma and flavor. Harvest adjusted accordingly. Attention followed the plant's signals. Herbs harvested in the morning often contained higher concentrations of aromatic oils. Overnight cooling allowed oils to settle. Morning harvest captured scent at its strongest. This pattern repeated often enough to be remembered. Timing became habitual. These reproductive and chemical strategies allowed herbs to persist with little intervention. They adapted to disturbance. They returned after cutting. They spread without effort. Survival was built into their design. Through runners, seeds, dormancy, and scent, herbs demonstrated resilience. They did not depend on constant care. They responded to environment rather than instruction. Their persistence encouraged trust, and that trust allowed humans to rely on them, season after season. With continued observation, patterns in their behavior became easier to recognize. Many of these patterns were not visual at first. They were sensory. They were noticed through smell, timing, and subtle changes in growth. the strong scents produced by many herbs serve as defense mechanisms. These aromas are created by chemical compounds that discourage grazing animals and insects. They signal that the plant is not an easy target. This strategy developed long before humans paid attention. It existed as part of survival. Animals learned to avoid certain smells. Insects altered their paths. Plants that produced effective scents survived more often. Over time, these traits became common among many herbs. Scent became protection. Humans learned to notice these same signals. A plant with a strong aroma stood out among others. Its presence was easier to remember. Smell became an early form of identification. Recognition happened before detailed observation. Because scent traveled farther than sight, it guided gathering. A familiar aroma could be detected before a plant was visible. This allowed people to find herbs even when leaves were hidden or small. The nose led movement. Eyes followed. Many herbs produce flowers that signal changes in the plant cycle. Flowering often indicated that the plant had reached a new stage. Leaves collected before flowering often differed from those gathered afterward. Flavor and aroma shifted subtly. These changes were learned through repetition. Flowering acted as a natural marker. It told people when to harvest and when to wait. No measurement was required. The plant communicated through visible change. Timing aligned with observation. Herbs harvested in the morning often contained higher concentrations of aromatic oils. During the night, cooler temperatures allowed oils to settle within leaves. Morning harvest captured scent before heat dispersed it. This pattern repeated often enough to become routine. Time of day mattered. These signals encouraged gentler interaction. Rather than forcing growth, people learned to respond to cues. Harvesting followed the plant's rhythm. This responsiveness supported longevity. Care replaced extraction. Defense mechanisms also shaped how herbs were used. Strong scents that deterred animals also preserved food. The same compounds served multiple purposes. Plants that protected themselves also protected stored goods. Use followed availability. Because these signals were reliable, herbs did not require constant attention. Their cues were consistent. Flowering returned each year. Morning scent repeated. Recognition became effortless. Over time, these sensory patterns shaped human perception. People trusted smell and timing without questioning them. The body learned what to expect. Attention softened. Routine replaced decision-making. These defense and signaling systems reinforced a slow relationship with plants. Nothing happened suddenly. Changes unfolded gradually. Understanding accumulated quietly. Herbs rewarded patience. Through scent, flowering, and daily cycles, herbs communicated without words. They indicated readiness, protection, and transition. Humans learned to listen by observing, and this listening strengthened the quiet partnership that allowed herbs to remain part of daily life. When knowledge about these patterns became commonplace, attention shifted toward how plants were harvested. Harvesting was not treated as removal. It was treated as interaction. Careful harvesting ensured that herbs would return. Traditional herb harvesting avoided damaging the plant's roots. Roots anchored the plant to soil and stored energy for regrowth. Disturbing them weakened the plant's ability to return. Through observation, people learned to cut above the root rather than pull. This small restraint made a lasting difference. Harvesting was often selective rather than complete. Only certain leaves or stems were taken at a time. The rest of the plant was left intact. This allowed photosynthesis to continue. Growth resumed without interruption. Repeated gentle harvesting could extend an herb's lifespan. Plants responded to careful cutting by producing new growth. This response encouraged moderation. Taking less resulted in more over time. Sustainability emerged through practice. Some herbs gradually became woody as they aged. Their stems thickened. Growth slowed. Leaves became more concentrated. These changes signaled maturity rather than decline. Woody herbs often lived for many years. Once established, they returned reliably. Their presence marked continuity rather than renewal. Harvesting adjusted to their pace. Care became lighter rather than frequent. Annual herbs followed a different rhythm. They completed their life cycle within a single season. They grew quickly, flowered, set seed, and faded. Harvesting them required awareness of timing. Once the cycle ended, waiting replaced action. Perennial herbs returned year after year from the same root system. Their growth followed familiar patterns. Harvesting could be spread across seasons. This allowed steadier use. The plant's presence felt dependable. Biennial herbs occupied an in-between rhythm. They spent the first year building strength. The second year brought flowering and seed production. Harvesting respected this longer cycle. Patience became part of care. Understanding these life cycles shaped harvesting practices. People adjusted their actions based on how each plant lived. No single method applied to all herbs. Observation guided decisions. Flexibility mattered. Harvesting also reflected respect for the plant's future. The goal was not maximum yield in a single moment. It was continuity. Ensuring return mattered more than quantity. This mindset shaped daily routines. Because harvesting was gentle, herbs remained present over long periods. Gardens stayed productive without exhaustion. Wild stands recovered naturally. This balance required little effort once understood. The relationship stabilized. Over time, harvesting became intuitive. Hands learned where to cut. Eyes recognized signs of readiness. No measurement was required. The body remembered. This familiarity reduced decision-making. Nothing needed to be planned extensively. Harvesting happened naturally within routine. Plants and people moved together. Interaction remained calm. Through careful harvesting, herbs demonstrated resilience. They returned when treated gently. They faded when taken aggressively. These lessons reinforced moderation. Care became embedded in habit. Harvesting with care allowed herbs to remain companions rather than resources. They were engaged repeatedly without being depleted. This approach sustained both plant and practice, and it ensured that herbs continued to grow alongside human life, quietly and reliably, season after season. Different herbs followed different life cycles, and these life cycles aligned closely with climate. Over generations, this relationship influenced which plants became central to regional routines. Perennial herbs return year after year from the same root system, Once established, they persist through seasonal changes with little interruption. Their growth resumes when conditions allow. This reliability made them foundational in many environments. They required patience at the beginning and offered continuity afterward. Annual herbs followed a shorter rhythm. They completed their entire life cycle in a single growing season. They sprouted, grew, flowered, produced seed, and faded. Their presence was brief but predictable. Harvesting focused on timing rather than longevity. Biennial herbs occupied a slower pattern. They spent their first year developing roots and leaves. The second year brought flowering and seed production. Use required long-term awareness. Results arrived only after waiting. These life cycles influenced where herbs fit best. Plants with longer cycles favored stable environments. Shorter cycle herbs adapted well to changing conditions. Over time, people learned which rhythms matched their surroundings. Practice aligned with environment. Climate played a central role in shaping herbal traditions. In warmer regions, drought-tolerant herbs became prominent. Mediterranean climates favored plants that thrived in dry summers and mild winters. Small leaves, deep roots, and aromatic oils supported survival. These herbs required little water once established. In cooler regions, different qualities mattered. Herbs needed to tolerate shorter growing seasons. Cold resistance and rapid growth became important. Plants adapted to brief windows of warmth. Harvesting adjusted to compressed timelines. Because of these differences, regional cuisines developed distinct herbal profiles. Local plants shaped local flavor. What grew easily was used often. This connection formed naturally through availability rather than preference. Tradition followed environment. As people migrated, they carried familiar herbs with them. Some plants adapted to new climates, others did not. When a herb struggled, local alternatives took its place. Adaptation preserved continuity. This process encouraged flexibility rather than preservation of form. The role of herbs remained consistent even as specific plants changed. Preparation methods shifted subtly. New routines formed without disruption. The relationship endured. Over centuries, herbal traditions adapted slowly to changing climates. Temperature shifts altered growing seasons. Rain patterns changed availability. Practices adjusted gradually rather than abruptly. Stability emerged through responsiveness. Despite these changes, many herbs required minimal care once established. They responded to environment rather than management. This made them resilient to shifting conditions. Gardens adapted without constant intervention. Care remained light. These climate-driven patterns reinforced a slower sense of time. Herbs grew when conditions allowed. They rested when conditions changed. Human routines adjusted accordingly. Patience remained central. By observing life cycles and climate influence, people learned to work with nature rather than against it. Herbal practices reflected acceptance of variability. Nothing was forced to grow out of season. Timing was respected. Continuity followed. Through life cycles shaped by climate, herbs became reliable guides to place and season. They signaled change through growth and absence. They anchored routines within environmental rhythm, and they continued to adapt quietly, sustaining their role in human life across landscapes and centuries. Herbs gradually moved indoors. They were no longer only things that grew outside or were gathered at certain times. They entered the spaces where people rested, stored belongings, and passed time quietly. Herbs became part of the interior world. In many homes, herbs were grown or kept near doorways and paths. This was not symbolic at first. It was practical. Plants placed along natural routes were easier to notice and easier to reach. Use followed movement. Passing by herbs each day created a quiet relationship. They were seen often but handled lightly. Their presence did not interrupt activity. It blended into routine. Familiarity grew without effort. Inside living spaces, herbs influenced the air itself. Even when untouched, many plants release subtle scent. This scent did not overwhelm the room. It lingered gently, changing slowly over time. The air felt inhabited rather than neutral. Before manufactured fragrances existed, herbs provided natural scenting. There were no sudden changes, no sharp contrasts. A room smelled the way it always had, shaped by plants that lived there. Consistency replaced intensity. This gradual scenting helped regulate atmosphere. Strong odors faded. Enclosed spaces felt softer. Air carried familiarity rather than novelty. The environment supported calm without announcing it. Herbs were also used directly with clothing and textiles. Dried leaves were placed among folded garments. They rested between layers of fabric. Over time, scent transferred gently. Clothing carried memory when worn. Linens stored with herbs absorbed aroma slowly. Sheets, blankets, and towels retained familiar scent long after storage. This scent did not demand attention. It appeared only when the item was used. Recognition came quietly. Herb sachets became common household objects. Small bundles of dried plants were tied in cloth and placed in storage chests. Their purpose was practical. They deterred insects and preserved scent. They required no upkeep once prepared. Preparing sachets became part of seasonal routine. When herbs were dried, some were set aside specifically for this use. Nothing formal marked the process. It happened alongside other tasks. Habit guided action. Over time, sachets became expected rather than noticed. They were replaced when needed. Their presence was assumed. They functioned quietly without inspection. Use continued because it worked. The drying and hanging of herbs became a recurring domestic rhythm. At certain times of year, bundles appeared inside homes. They hung from beams, hooks, or walls. Their presence marked season without explanation. Time was visible. These hanging herbs changed interior space. They introduced texture and movement. They caught light differently throughout the day. They reminded people of cycles without requiring attention. Change became gentle. Drying herbs indoors also brought the outside inward. The scent of leaves and stems lingered. Growth continued even after harvest, slowly shifting form. Plants transitioned from living to stored without urgency. The boundary between outside and inside softened. As these practices repeated year after year, they became automatic. No one decided where herbs belonged. They were placed where they had always been. Hands moved without instruction. Knowledge lived in motion. Herbs in living spaces reduced the sense of separation between care and rest. They did not belong to a workspace alone. They existed where people slept, gathered, and paused. Their presence supported continuity. Life felt less divided. This integration shaped emotional familiarity. A home smelled the same across years. Seasonal changes arrived gradually. Nothing shifted abruptly. The environment held memory. Because herbs were always nearby, interaction required no effort. A bundle could be adjusted in passing. A sachet replaced without pause. Care happened quietly, without planning. Nothing demanded attention. Over time, herbs became part of the home's identity. They shaped atmosphere rather than appearance. They marked seasons without calendars. They carried memory without words. Presence replaced explanation. Through scent, placement, and repetition, herbs settled fully into living spaces. They did not stand out. They belonged. And in belonging, they continued their quiet role, shaping the inner world just as steadily as they had shaped the outer one. As herbal practices matured, people began to organize their use around time rather than impulse. Herbs were not gathered randomly. They were harvested, stored, and prepared according to rhythms that repeated each year. Calendars formed quietly through observation rather than record keeping. Herbal traditions often followed agricultural calendars. Certain tasks returned predictably. Harvesting appeared at familiar moments. Drying followed shortly after. Storage settled in as the season shifted. These calendars were not written on paper. They were held in memory and reinforced through routine. Seeing a plant reach a familiar stage signaled action. No dates were required. The environment provided the cue. Certain herbs were harvested only at specific times of year. Leaves were gathered when growth was strongest. Flowers were taken at peak bloom. Roots were collected when energy had retreated underground. Timing shaped quality. Harvesting outside these windows often produced different results. Flavor changed, aroma weakened, effectiveness shifted. Through repetition, people learned when to act and when to wait. Patience became part of preparation. Once harvested, attention turned towards storage. Proper storage extended usefulness without altering routine. Herbs were dried fully before being stored. Residual moisture shortened lifespan. Dryness preserved aroma. The color of dried herbs became an important indicator of freshness. Vibrant greens suggested recent drying. Dull or faded tones signaled age. This visual cue required no tools. Observation was enough. Smell reinforced this assessment. A strong aroma indicated retained oils. A flat scent suggested loss. Together, color and smell guided use. Nothing needed to be measured. Properly stored herbs retained aroma longer than those exposed to light or moisture. Dark storage protected volatile compounds. Dry air prevented spoilage. These conditions were learned through experience rather than instruction. Storage improved gradually. Containers were chosen based on environment. Some herbs remained in bundles. Others were placed in jars or cloth sacks. Placement mattered more than material. What worked stayed. Preparation occurred just before use whenever possible. Grinding herbs released aromatic oils immediately. Crushing leaves or seeds activated scent that had been preserved during storage. This timing ensured freshness. Preparation aligned with need. Mortars and pestles were commonly used for this purpose. These tools allowed controlled crushing without heat. Movement released aroma gradually. Sound and rhythm accompanied preparation. The process was calm and repetitive. Grinding became a sensory act. Hands felt resistance. Noses detected release. Timing adjusted instinctively. Preparation was guided by attention rather than instruction. Some herbs were prepared through steeping. Others were crushed or burned. Each method released different qualities. Preparation followed tradition shaped by environment. No single method dominated. Because preparation happened close to use, herbs retained immediacy. They were not processed far in advance. This reduced waste. It also maintained sensory connection. Smell and touch remained central. Calendars, storage, and preparation worked together. Harvesting aligned with season. Storage preserved potential. Preparation released it. Each step supported the next. These practices created a sense of continuity. Tasks returned predictably. Nothing needed to be reinvented. Routine replaced decision-making. Time flowed gently. Over generations, these patterns became automatic. People did not think about calendars. They recognized signs. Hands moved when needed. Knowledge lived in habit. This approach reduced urgency. There was no pressure to act immediately. Herbs would be ready when their time came. Storage created security. Preparation restored freshness. Through seasonal timing, careful storage, and mindful preparation, herbs remained dependable. They fit into life without complication. They rewarded patience and attention. And they continued to support daily routines quietly, year after year, without demanding change or explanation. People began developing simple ways to prepare them. These methods did not emerge from theory. They grew out of repeated handling, observation, and need. Tools evolved to support familiarity rather than efficiency. One of the most common tools for preparing herbs was the mortar and pestle. This pairing appeared in many cultures independently. A shallow bowl and a rounded stone were enough. No sharp edges were required. Movement did the work. Using a mortar and pestle allowed control. Herbs could be crushed slowly or firmly. Aroma was released gradually rather than all at once. Hands guided pressure. Attention stayed present. This method avoided heat. Grinding by hand preserved volatile oils. Scent emerged naturally through friction. Preparation remained gentle. The herb's character stayed intact. Herbal preparation methods varied by culture and environment. What worked in one place shifted in another. Availability of tools influenced technique. So did climate and tradition. No single method became universal. Some herbs were steeped in warm water. Others were crushed directly. Some were burned to release scent into the air. Each method revealed different qualities. Preparation followed purpose. The same herb could be used in multiple ways. Leaves might be steeped for one use. The same leaves could be crushed for another. Burning produced yet another effect. Versatility emerged through experimentation. Because herbs were prepared close to use, freshness mattered. Grinding happened moments before application. Steeping followed shortly after harvesting or drying. This immediacy preserved aroma. preparation remained connected to time. Tools reflected this closeness. Mortars and pestles stayed within reach. They were stored near kitchens or workspaces. Their presence suggested readiness rather than activity. Nothing needed to be set up. Over generations, herbal combinations were refined. Certain pairings worked better together. Some balanced flavor, others enhanced aroma. These combinations were remembered because they repeated. Refinement did not require documentation. Successful combinations were used again. Unsuccessful ones faded. Memory favored what worked quietly. Practice shaped tradition. Cultural variation influenced combinations. Local plants shaped local mixtures. Environment dictated availability. Preparation adapted accordingly. Diversity remained intact. Tools also influenced pace. Manual preparation slowed interaction. Crushing and grinding took time. This enforced patience. Preparation became a moment rather than a task. Sound played a role as well. The rhythm of grinding created a steady pace. Movement repeated predictably. Attention followed motion. The process supported calm. Herbal techniques were not designed to maximize output. They were designed to fit into daily life. Preparation could be paused and resumed. Nothing spoiled quickly. Flexibility mattered. Because techniques were simple, knowledge spread easily. Anyone could learn by watching. Hands copied motion. No instruction was required. Understanding lived in repetition. As societies changed, these tools persisted. Materials varied. Designs shifted slightly, but the function remained the same. Manual preparation endured. Modern methods did not replace traditional ones entirely. They layered on top. Hand preparation continued where it made sense. The relationship remained tactile. Herbs stayed connected to touch. Through tools and techniques, herbs remained approachable. Preparation did not separate people from plants. It reinforced connection. Hands, scent, and motion worked together. The process remained human. These simple methods ensured that herbs stayed versatile and adaptable. They could be prepared differently depending on need. Tools supported variation rather than standardization. And through this flexibility, herbs continued to fit naturally into changing lives, just as they always had. The spreading of herbal practices resulted in connections to place and memory. Knowledge did not exist as abstract information. It lived within landscapes, routines, and families. Understanding was shaped by where people lived and how they moved through their environment. Early healers memorized plant locations within their surroundings. They did not rely on maps or written directions. They remembered where herbs grew by walking the land repeatedly. Paths, trees, and changes in terrain became reference points. The landscape itself held the knowledge. This familiarity allowed gathering to feel effortless. Plants were not searched for. They were expected. Returning to the same locations each year reinforced memory. Absence or presence became noticeable without effort. Herbal knowledge was often tied to specific regions or families. Practices varied from place to place. What worked in one environment might not work in another. This localized understanding preserved diversity. There was no single system to replace all others. Within families, Herbal practices were passed down quietly. Children learned by accompanying adults. They watched where plants were gathered. They observed how herbs were prepared. Learning happened alongside daily life. Certain herbs became associated with specific meals or seasons. A plant used during winter storage carried different meaning than one used in spring. Meals repeated year after year. Herbs marked time through taste and scent. Tradition followed routine. As communities connected, herbs became among the first plants traded between them. Dried leaves and seeds traveled easily. They carried both utility and familiarity. Trade introduced new plants without replacing old ones. Diversity increased. Trade expanded the global movement of herbs. Roots that carried grain and tools also carried seeds and bundles. Some herbs adapted quickly to new environments. They grew readily in unfamiliar soil. Others required careful cultivation. When herbs struggled outside their native regions, people adjusted. They modified preparation. They altered planting locations. Some plants were kept in controlled spaces. Adaptation shaped practice. Over time, many herbs became naturalized far from their original habitats. They integrated into new ecosystems. Their presence felt local rather than imported. Herbal traditions absorbed these changes. Familiarity returned. Despite expansion, herbal knowledge remained grounded in observation. New plants were tested slowly. If they worked, they stayed. If not, they faded. Selection favored reliability. As modern medicine developed, herbal use did not disappear. It continued alongside new systems. People maintained familiar practices. Herbs remained part of daily routines. Continuity mattered. This coexistence preserved older knowledge without conflict. Herbs did not compete with modern approaches. They filled different roles. Their presence was steady rather than oppositional. Balance emerged naturally. Through memory, trade, and adaptation, herbal practices expanded without losing their foundation. Knowledge remained tied to place even as plants moved. Families carried routines forward. Landscapes changed gradually. The relationship endured. Herbs became connectors between regions and generations. They linked meals, seasons, and environments. And through quiet exchange, they continued to travel, adapt, and remain part of human life, without demanding attention or explanation. Moving across landscapes, their ability to adapt became more visible. Trade and migration carried plants far from the places where they first grew. Some adjusted easily. Others required patience. Over time, this process revealed which herbs could persist beyond their original environments. Some herbs adapted quickly to new regions after being introduced. They responded to unfamiliar soil and climate without difficulty. Growth patterns shifted subtly. Leaves adjusted. Scent remained recognizable. These adaptable herbs spread along paths, settlements, and fields. They took root near human activity. Their presence became familiar rather than foreign. Within a few generations, they felt local. Origin faded into background. Other herbs required careful cultivation outside their native regions. They depended on specific conditions. Soil composition mattered. Light and moisture needed adjustment. Care became more attentive. For these plants, people recreated familiar environments as closely as possible. Gardens were altered, placement changed, protection increased, effort reflected value. Over time, some of these carefully tended herbs also adapted. Gradual exposure encouraged resilience. Plants adjusted generation by generation. Once established, care lessened. Familiarity returned. Many herbs eventually became naturalized far from their original habitats. They integrated into local ecosystems. They reproduced without assistance. Their presence no longer felt intentional. They simply belonged. This naturalization did not erase earlier knowledge. People remembered where plants came from. But daily interaction mattered more than origin. Use defined belonging. Routine replaced history. As environments changed, herbal practices continued to shift. Climate variation altered growing seasons. Urbanization changed available space. Yet herbs found ways to persist. Adaptation remained central. Even as modern medicine developed, herbal use continued. It did not disappear. It changed position. Herbs remained part of daily routines rather than formal systems. Coexistence emerged naturally. People continued to grow, store, and prepare herbs alongside modern tools. Familiar practices remained. New methods layered on top. Nothing needed to be replaced. Balance held. Herbs also persisted because they required little to continue. Many grew easily in small spaces. Containers replaced fields. Windowsills replaced gardens. Presence adjusted to circumstance. This flexibility allowed herbs to remain accessible. They did not require specialization. Anyone could participate. Use stayed personal rather than institutional. Continuity endured. Over generations, herbal knowledge adapted quietly. Certain practices faded. Others remained. What worked stayed. What did not disappeared without conflict. Herbs became part of inherited routine rather than formal teaching. People knew what to do without knowing why. Hands repeated familiar actions. Memory lived in habit. Understanding persisted. Modern life introduced new rhythms. Time felt faster. Spaces grew smaller. Yet herbs continued to find place. They adapted alongside people. Their persistence reflected more than usefulness. It reflected compatibility. Herbs fit into changing lives without demanding attention. They remained present through adjustment rather than resistance. This quiet flexibility ensured survival. Through migration, adaptation, and coexistence with modern systems, herbs remained steady companions. They adjusted without losing identity. They persisted without conflict. And they continued to bridge past and present. Not by standing still, but by moving gently with the world around them. Unlike herbs, we are coming to the end of our quiet journey. There is nothing that needs to be concluded. Herbs do not arrive at a final point. They continue, they grow, they return, they adapt. They remain present without asking to be noticed. From wild landscapes to small gardens, from doorways to kitchens, from memory to routine, herbs have followed human life gently and patiently. They have never demanded attention. They have never required belief. They have simply been there. The same plants that once grew along ancient paths still grow near modern homes. Hands still reach for leaves. Aroma still rises when herbs are crushed or steeped. Time moves forward, but the motions remain familiar. This continuity is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It lives in repetition, in small acts done without thought, in routines that feel natural rather than learned. Herbs remind us that not everything needs to change quickly to remain relevant. Some things endure because they fit quietly into life as it is. They adapt without losing their character. They persist without resistance. As you rest now, there is nothing to remember and nothing to do. The patterns continue on their own. Just as herbs grow without being watched, this moment can pass without effort. Thank you for being here and for sharing this calm space. The world continues gently, and so can you. Good night.